Hello and welcome to this special episode of Motive Garage where we're going to show you how to build a 10-second street GT-R. Nissan's R32 GT-R burst onto the scene in 1989 and dominated Group A racing, and since then has become an iconic car amongst the tuning industry and the PlayStation generation. So why are the R32 through R34 GT-Rs so popular? Well, beyond its racing pedigree, the RB26 engine can make massive power, the chassis can handle it, and the all-wheel drive system can put the power to the ground. It has seen success in circuit, time attack, tarmac rally, drag racing, hell, even drifting. But most importantly, you can build a very quick and well-balanced street car. The GT-R scene has boomed in Australia since the early 2000s, and now the GT-R is making its mark in the USA. 10-second GT-Rs have become almost normal, and there is plenty of 9 and even 8-second street-driven GT-Rs. In fact, the quickest street GT-Rs in the world, which are full-bodied, registered cars on a radial tyre, all come from Australia and are all now deep into the 7s. Want some proof of how awesome they are? Well, just watch this. Now the GT-R isn't perfect, certainly has its weaknesses, many of which have been well documented, but we wanted to find out for ourselves just how much of that information is fact versus myth, and that's what led to this car, our R32 GT-R, affectionately known as Project Budget Supercar. Now after 6 years of development, it's led to it being the quickest GT-R that we know of on a stock bottom end, having run a 992 at nearly 144 miles per hour. All while remaining drivable, responsive, and a fun all-round street car, the way a GT-R should be. Our philosophy with this car from day one has always been to only replace parts that are either broken or we need to upgrade them to get more power. And this has led to finding the true limits of each and every part on the car. Now the car gained popularity on our YouTube channel as we tried to dispel as many myths as we could about the GT-R. And to be honest, we pushed it well beyond what we thought we ever would. And you can watch all of those videos on our YouTube channel. Now that experience with this car is what's going to enable us to tell you everything that you need to know. Now one thing you need to do now is make a choice. Do you want the GT-R to be an all-rounder that can turn, accelerate and stop and be a fun street car where you can do nearly anything with it? Or do you want to build the car to just focus on going quick in a straight line? Now the reason you need to make this choice because it will determine how much power you need and probably how much money you need to spend. Now a GT-R that's dedicated to drag racing can run a 10 with as little as 125 miles per hour. But if you want to run in the 10s on street tyres and the car set up for handling, you really need to aim for more like 130 mile per hour down the quarter worth of power in the car. The other thing you need to choose is fuel. Now we switched to E85 pretty early due to the fact that it's incredibly safe, knock resistance, you can make heaps more power by running more boost, and to be honest, the car wouldn't have been able to do what it's done without E85. Now, we're going to be talking about drivetrain, we're going to be talking about suspension, tyres, and lastly, we're going to talk about how to make the power. Now when it comes to the drivetrain, unlike other four-wheel drives, it's actually pretty easy with the GT-R. The stock front and rear diffs, the stock transfer case, and all of the stock shafts are more than capable of running into the 10-second zone, and we've even seen them go into the 9s. In fact, we recommend, unless they're broken, don't touch them. Leave the four-wheel drive system the way it is. Now one thing you do have to upgrade is the clutch. Now a single plate clutch can just be made to work, but we recommend just go straight to a good twin plate clutch. That way you get the clamping force that you need to hold a four-wheel drive on launch, as well as getting the drivability. Now we've always used direct clutch services twin plates. We've done hundreds of launches in the car and it's never let us down. Now the next thing to talk about is the gearbox itself. Now R32 and R33 5-speeds are notorious for breaking third gear when driven aggressively, which is true. However, they can go into the 10s no problem, and we've even seen stock 5-speeds go into the 9s. But it's all about how you drive it. Now, it's not the speed of the shift, it's the way that you come off the clutch once you're in third. Doing that will help the gearbox survive for quite a while. However, with big power, you are eventually going to break it. Now, the Jet-Trag 6-speed out of the R34 GT-R is a much stronger transmission, very similar to the Supra 6-speed. So strong, in fact, that most R34 owners don't even bother to change a transmission, even with 1,000 horsepower. Now, as far as we're concerned, the only upgrade after a Jet-Trag is a 6-speed sequential gearbox, which is exactly what we did thanks to our friends at PPG. Now, by switching to that gearbox, we get dog engagement for faster shifts, which gives us more mile an hour, and we don't drop off boost. We also get better ratios that are optimized for a GT-R, and the most important thing is it's a whole load of fun. So the factory drivetrain's pretty good, and so is the factory suspension. But once you start modifying it, that's when you need to decide between whether you want to set the car up for handling or if you only care about drag racing. Now, the factory GT-R suspension is actually pretty good for a mildly powered GT-R, and we've seen them run into the 10s without touching the suspension at all. Now, GT-Rs suffer terribly from camber curve. Basically, when they squat, once the rear arms become horizontal, after that, they've got shocking camber curve, which basically means they get heaps of mid camber on launch, you get less contact patch on the ground, and you'll lose a whole bunch of traction for drag racing. Our recommendation is don't lower the car any more than having the rear lower arms level, as that's really the right spot for handling and a good compromise for straight line grip as well. So one of the best things you can do, whether you're setting it up for drag racing or handling, is to install aftermarket adjustable rear camber arms. Now, if you want to go drag racing, you actually set the camber to be positive statically. So as it squats, it ends up being 0 for maximum traction. Now, if you want to set the car up for handling though, don't go crazy on the static neg camber, especially on a street tyre. We run about -0.5 for two reasons. It gives us good grip in a straight line, but when the car actually turns into a corner and the weight transfers to the outside, the camber curve means it gets more negative camber in the corner anyway. In fact, before we added our rear camber arms, we were struggling to get into the 10s with just too much wheel spin off the line. So we actually raised the car, installed rear camber arms, and changed our camber setting, and straight away, next pass, into the 10s. Now, when it comes to the front suspension, you can pretty much set it up for handling or leave the stock suspension. Negative camber on the front is actually a good thing, because as the car lifts, they tend to go back to 0 for better traction as well. Now, the big thing you've got to worry about with a GT-R is the fact that, well, they're old, so some suspension components would just be simply worn out. Now, we went and replaced all of the bushes in the car with brand new Super Pro items, which basically makes the car drive like brand new. Now, we also installed Super Pro sway bars as well for better handling, and we installed team coilovers with EDSC. Now, these are relatively soft, so they do really well on the street, they're still great for handling, and they're not too bad for drag racing either, which gives us the ultimate all-round GT-R. Now, the next thing to talk about is tyres. To be honest, this is the most important thing with your GT-R to determine how easily you're going to run into the 10s. Now, if you want to try and do 10s on street tyres, that's pretty much going to depend on the surface. I've seen some cars run high 1.5 second 60-foot times on a street tyre, but that is very rare. Generally, you're going to run in the 1.7s to 1.8s. Now, this means you're going to get a whole lot more wheel spin than you expect on takeoff when you're driving on a street tyre. In fact, we had that exact problem to begin with when we were first trying to get into the 10s. Now, as the power increases, this problem just gets worse and worse and worse. You really need to switch to a drag radial if you want to try and get the optimum time out of your GT-R at the strip. Now, we've found that generally, if you want to run in the 10s on a street tyre, you need the power for 130 mile per hour, while if you want to run into the 10s on a drag radial, you can get away with power for as little as 125 mile per hour. Now, we've done back-to-back testing of street tyres versus drag radials, and on an unprepped track at an airport, we found that the times dropped from mid 1.8s down to high 1.5s, and when we went to the drag strip, those 60-foot times dropped from mid 1.7s down to mid 1.5s. Now, that 2/10 at the 60-foot mark became 4/10 at the finish line, which is the general rule of thumb. So basically, we went from running 1070s to running 1030s just by switching to drag radials. Now, if you're setting your car up for handling like we were, you're going to run a 17 or an 18-inch wheel so you can clear those big brakes, But a drag radial on that rim is more than sufficient for running quick times. However, if you're setting it up for drag racing, simply stick with the factory 16-inch wheels to give yourself the biggest sidewall possible. So basically, if you whack on a set of drag radials, you're going to run 10s a lot easier and with less power. So now it's time to talk about making that power. Now when it comes to making power with a GT-R, there is a whole bunch of opinions, myths and mistakes about tuning the legendary RB26. Now sorting out fact from fiction is the main reason we developed Project Budget Supercar. Now the myths surround the oil pump, oil control and the strength of the block, and we can tell you firsthand that some of them are definitely myths and some of them are definitely facts. Now first up, the oil pump. Now the RB26 was developed with two different types of cranks and oil pump, the short nose crank and the long nose crank. Now basically a short nose crank only has a very small surface area that contacts with the oil pump and it's prone to failure. This is why Nissan changed it halfway through the R32 GT-R's model cycle. Now if you have a short nose crank, it's fairly likely it's going to break. However, you might make it into the 10s before it does, but you do need to stick to the factory 7,500 RPM rev limit. Now, the long nose crank and oil pump setup. This is where the myth comes in, because people think that they can't handle any power, but we have most certainly proven that wrong. We've made over 730 wheel horsepower in our GT-R, which some people say is pretty much 900 engine horsepower, and it's still going after 6 years, let alone the 15 years where we don't even know how it was driven before that. Now, some oil pumps have probably just broken due to old age and wear and tear, but we can tell you what does break them. Number one culprit is rev limiter. Secondly, taking the RPM beyond the factory rev limiter. And thirdly, anything that shock loads the oil pump, such as two-step, launch control, flat shift, even detonation or misfires can shock load the oil pump and break it. Now we know these things, so we've tuned the car and we drive it around those issues. We have an 8,200 RPM rev limiter that we try to never touch. We don't dump the clutch on launch wherever we can avoid it. We try to ride the clutch, and we just don't do silly burnouts or stupid driving in the car. If we have any problems with it, we shut it down, we diagnose it rather than risk the engine. Now the next issue is oil starvation. Now when a GT-R is subject to high G loadings, either in the launch or when cornering at the track, especially with grippy tyres, they're known for oil starvation problems. Now there's two parts to this. The first part is the sump, which gets starved of oil, and the second part is oil getting trapped in the head. Now this problem actually gets exaggerated by aftermarket oil pumps. Why? Well, because they're a high volume oil pump, which means they simply pump more oil. Now the RB26 is a high revving engine, which means a lot of oil ends up in the head. Now if you have a stock oil pump, then having rocker cover baffles like we do is generally enough. You also need to make sure that you've got a nice big catch can as well. But when you switch to an aftermarket oil pump, that's when you need to start worrying about keeping oil out of the head. This can be done with restrictors to the head, as well as adding an extra drain to the back of the head to get it back to the sump even quicker. Why is this so important though? Well, if the oil's trapped in the head and it's all being pushed towards the back, you can literally run out of oil in the sump. Now this leads us to the next problem, which is oil starvation in the sump. Now if the oil's trapped in the head or you're under high cornering or acceleration loads, sometimes the oil pickup can be starved of oil. Now if you've got a standard sump, we advise just putting a baffle into it if you can, or if not, just keep the oil level over full to make sure that you don't run out. Another great investment to look after the standard bottom end is an accumulator. Basically, this stores oil under pressure, so if the oil pump ever gets starved of oil, the accumulator takes up the slack to make sure that oil continues to circulate through the engine. But the golden rule is, if you have an aftermarket pump, you have to have an aftermarket sump. Why? Because you up the oil capacity to over 10 litres with some of these sumps, which basically means you should never run out. So the oil starvation issue is certainly a fact. Now the next issue to look at is the cracking of the block, a very big topic when it comes to RB26s, and in fact we know it's a problem because Nissan developed the N1 block and the GT blocks to go racing with. Now at what point do they crack? Well, it can vary. Ours cracked at 675 wheel horsepower. Now we were able to put JB World over the top and just keep on driving. The crack isn't that bad. That's only a temporary fix though. If you want to do it properly, you need to strengthen the block, but that's a topic for another episode. Now the next thing you need to consider with the engine itself is the head gasket and head studs. Now we found that basically once we hit 500 wheel horsepower, the factory head studs stretch, you lift the head and eventually you break a head gasket. We put a fresh head gasket and fresh head studs into the car. But bear in mind, if you're going to shoot for the sort of power we are, you need to skip ARP 2000s and go to the top of the line head stud that you can get. Now if you just want to scrape into the 10s with 125 mile per hour, you could probably get away with leaving stock head gasket and stock head studs. But as soon as you want to shoot for 130 mile per hour plus, it is a problem that you need to take care of. Now the last thing you want to look at for reliability is cooling. Now if you're only doing drag passes, just leave it standard, it won't be an issue. However, if you're building a 500 plus wheel horsepower street car, you will need to invest into an aftermarket oil cooler as a minimum, and we also recommend getting an aftermarket aluminium radiator as well. Now let's talk about making power. The most important thing you're going to choose is your turbocharger. Do you go twins? Do you go single? And we've already done that comparison on our YouTube channel, so we're not going to continue the argument here. Singles are better. Now, you basically want to choose a turbocharger that allows you to make the power to run the mile per hour that you want. But the other consideration is basically keeping a turbo that's a nice size to keep it nice and responsive and fun to drive as well. Now, a set of Garrett GT2860-7 low mount turbochargers bolt straight on, and they'll give you enough power on E85 to run over 130 miles per hour and run 10-second passes. In fact, we ran a 10.9 at 131 on street tyres, and it probably would have gone 1060s on drag radials. Now, if you're going single, the gun choice is the Garrett GTX 3582R. They can make nearly 700 wheel horsepower when squeezed and go nearly 140 miles per hour in an R32. But the turbo's still super responsive and a whole bunch of fun to drive. Check it out. Now, choosing the rear housing is going to determine the power potential and the response of the turbocharger, and we went for a 101 twin scroll rear housing. We matched that to a 6-boost twin scroll manifold and a TurboSmart external wastegate. It's a proven combo that works exceptionally well. So next is the exhaust system. Our advice is skip the 3-inch system and go straight to a 3.5-inch exhaust for power levels up to about 650 wheel horsepower. After that, you want to look at a 4-inch exhaust. Now you're also going to need to upgrade the intercooler. We upgraded to a 4-inch thick HKS intercooler, which does the job perfectly. Now next is the blow-off valves, which you can change if you want, but we've kept them completely standard. And after that is the inlet manifold. Now we've found that you just don't need to change it unless you're looking at 4 digits worth of horsepower. The factory 6 throttles and inlet manifold works perfectly fine for a car that's trying to run 10-second passes. Now the next thing to look at with airflow is camshafts. Now we've seen standard camshafts make enough power to do 125 mile per hour, but if you want to do it a little bit easier, you should look at upgrading the camshafts. Now we use Tomei Type B pond cams, which are a drop-in camshaft you can put straight in. Now it's recommended that you reshim the head, but you don't have to. Now if you're going to go over 27 or 28 PSI of boost, you do need to upgrade the valve springs, and if you do that, you definitely need to reshim the head, or you risk popping shims, which we did multiple times before we reshimmed the head. Now one thing that you must install is adjustable cam gears. These make for big improvements in mid-range power without sacrificing top-end power. If your tuner says that you don't need adjustable cam gears, it's time to find another tuner. So the next thing you're going to need to tackle on the GT-R is the fuel system. So we recommend installing a surge tank. Now you're still going to need to upgrade your in-tank pump because the factory one's probably gotten pretty old. You want to get something compatible with E85, such as one of the Walbro pumps that can flow over 400 litres per hour. Now when it comes to choosing fuel pumps to go with your surge tank, basically you need enough fuel flow to manage the power that you're trying to make. Now we've got a Holley Dominator, which is essentially 2 fuel pumps inside the one housing and capable of making 1,000 wheel horsepower, so more than enough for what we need. So once you've got your surge tank and your fuel pump sorted, you need to look at the fuel lines. Having one factory fuel line is simply not enough flow. Now one little trick that we've done is we actually used the factory fuel lines as a dual feed to the engine bay, so we only needed to add one -8 return line to the back of the car. Now the next myth when it comes to modifying the RB26 is the fuel rail. Now the factory fuel rail is big enough to handle plenty of power. The problem is actually the size of the inlet and the outlet into the fuel rail. So what we've done is we've actually modified the factory fuel rail by putting an extra outlet in the middle of the rail. Basically, we've converted it to a twin entry rail, so we basically have the two factory fuel lines going up, twin entry, have a single outlet that goes to the TurboSmart fuel pressure regulator, and the job's done. Now, the most important part of the fuel system is the injectors. Now, we only use Bosch stainless injectors as they can handle E85 without having any problems. Now, 1000cc injectors will handle low 600 at the wheels and get you into the high 130 mile per hour bracket. But if you want to make more power than that, you need 1650cc injectors, which we have now, that can support upwards of 800 wheel horsepower. And next on the list is the ignition system. Now, the factory ignition coils and igniter in a GT-R are actually pretty good. The problem is though, they're just old, and that's why they fail. Now, split fire coil packs are a very easy bolt-in solution to handle well over 600 horsepower, but the gun choice right now for ignition system is using the R35 GT-R coil packs. Now, we've got a billet coil pack kit from Godzilla Motorsport, more than capable of handling 2,000 horsepower, which means we're never going to have a problem. Now, the last thing to worry about is engine management. Personally, I like to go for a complete aftermarket engine management system. Now, this car has a Haltech Platinum plug-and-play ECU. This means we have a whole bunch of features that we need, like engine protection systems. We've also got control over boost. We can also have nitrous control. We can have launch control. In fact, we can pretty much have whatever we need. And we've got the flex fuel option as well for E85. Now, once you've got all of your car together, now you've got to get it tuned. This will make or break the way your car drives, as well as whether it will survive. Finding a good tuner is probably the most important thing that you're going to need to do. Now, we use Croydon Racing Developments here in Sydney because they've been working on GT-R since the late 90s, and they've got some of the fastest and most powerful and reliable GT-Rs in the world. Our car has done over 200 pulls on the dyno at Croydon Racing Developments in the last 6 years, and the stock bottom end is still going. If that's not enough testament to how good the tuning is, well, I guess nothing will. Now, to be honest, we've pushed the car well beyond what we ever thought was going to be possible with the stock bottom end, but hopefully our research and development has given you guys the knowledge that you need to build your GT-R and dispelled a few myths along the way. Now, the best part is the car's still going. So where are we going to go next? Well, you have to watch our YouTube channel to find out.